Hi, Roger. I hope you're well. Today I'm
Uh,
meeting with Roger Emerson, author of Land of Stone, A Journey Through Modern Architecture in Scotland, which was launched yesterday with us here at Louth Press. So, Roger, how was your launch, by the way? Did it go all well?
it was great.
Yeah.
It was a sellout, which
Oh,
I,
that's
I,
grand.
I gathered from Claire Kavanagh at the bookshop. This was not usual, so that was good. There was actually a waiting list of people.
Oh, wow.
Um, um, they seemed to have sold out most of the books. I think there's only two left at the end, and Gavin is now under some pressure uh, to get some more books into the bookshop. But it was great. The talk went well. I had a lot of very nice words afterwards with people. It was terrific.
That's so good to hear. Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, turning to the topic of the book, what first of all brought you to write this book?
Um, I think it was what was missing, I think, was what did it. I wouldn't say I've read everything on the history of Scottish architecture, but I've read a lot over the years. And what I found that was missing was ideas. There were no ideas in it. There were taxonomies, there were ideas from elsewhere, but there are no ideas generated in Scotland. That to me was a puzzle, simply because Scotland has such a fantastic philosophical tradition all the
Mhm.
way through from Duns Scotus in the 13th century, David Hume, the 18th century, Alexander MacIntyre in the 20th century. I mean, and many others. It's solid. And I thought, well, why was that not in architecture? Why was it all that we talked about was the aesthetics? What did it look like? Um, so that was really the start. What was missing? I mean, there were other things missing as well. I mean, the obvious gaps were women, people of color, and the working class. I mean, that was obviously missing from it as well. And I do make reference to that in the book. But my prime objective was to try and uncover ideas that were relevant to architecture and which were generated in Scotland.
Grand, excellent. So beginning to write this book, how did you begin your research, or where did it first emerge from?
Oh, conversations in the 1980s, believe it or not,
Mhm.
there was a kind of there was a perception at the time that there should be a contemporary architecture which derived from the same sources as Charles Rennie Mackintosh had derived his architecture. So there was a discussion largely around the significance of Scottish baronial architecture and what that might do. I was part of that discussion, and both in terms of writing and, in fact, doing speculative designs as to how that might come about, and one of which is illustrated in the book. Um, I even wrote a preliminary, what did it call it? A preliminary notes on a developing theory of Scottish architecture, which was published in 1986. Um, but really, the serious work didn't begin till I made two trips, one to Finland and one to Czechoslovakia, because I wanted to see how their architecture had developed and how they had become modern in a sense, and why those conditions didn't seem to be or hadn't happened in Scotland. So really, it wasn't until the late 90s that I actually put pen to paper. I have a photograph of my desk in a flat in Forest Hill with papers on it. I didn't have a typewriter or anything then, so I was doing it by hand. So I would say about 1998, I actually started seriously. But then I went back to full time. I was teaching at the time, but then I went back to full time architectural work. And really, for the next 16 years, it was a struggle to do any writing. And I used my retirement after 2016 to develop what I was doing. And in particular, I used the pandemic because we weren't doing anything else to try and sit down and consolidate it. So that's the kind of history of it.
I see, I see. So when it comes to architecture itself, has that always been your calling, or did you ever?
No, I never had any doubts about it. I knew from the age, although I didn't know anything about it, but I knew from the age of 12 that's what I wanted to do. There wasn't
That's
anything else.
that's very
Yeah.
interesting. So yeah, so about Scottish architecture itself, what makes it so important to you, or what does it mean to you?
Well, it's a framework of our lives. I mean,
Hmm.
you know, whether we like it or dislike it, whether it's beneficial to us or not beneficial to us, it's what we're all involved in every day of our lives. It's the public art that is not an art, if you like. People ignore most of it, but it surrounds them constantly. Therefore, it requires attention. And that was why I was concerned to find out what were the ideas embedded in it, other than just ideas of doing good work, doing it well, or providing housing or providing hospitals. I mean, these are, if you like, technical issues.
Hmm.
You know, it's what you expect of a modern society. So it was the ideas behind it then that drove that. But yes, I mean, it's what's around us. We have to understand it.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, when it comes to your writing, what speaks to it? What inspired you as you began to write this book? Or what did you want from the book?
I actually had a notion, which was, and it's a political notion. I
Hmm.
think reading the book, it's no secret that I have leanings towards independence and nationalism. There's no secret about that. Although I don't push it to any extent in the book, but you know, reading between the lines, it must be obvious. And what I was very keen to discover um, was that in the architecture that surrounded us, was there anything consciously political? Because there certainly was in a brief period in the architecture in Finland, Czechoslovakia, Sweden, Denmark, Russia, um, 1930s Israel, 1920s, 30s Portugal, although that's somewhat coloured by the fascist regime there. But around the world, I could see there were architectures which had political content, sometimes very overt political content. By that, I don't mean totalitarian architecture. That's something else totally different. But it's all often confused with it. So my objective was there something political in Scottish architecture? I kind of imagined there might be, but actually, when it came to the bit, there isn't really. Um, you can infer it, but architects in Scotland are very circumspect and they're very cautious about declaring any political allegiance or anything of that sort. Very, very cautious. Um, I am not cautious. I've never been secretive about what my views were, but I couldn't, in all honesty, say that that was what was in Scottish architecture. It's not. There might be a tendency, but there's no overt
Hmm.
political message in Scottish architecture, none whatsoever. One might go even further and say, for a lot of Scottish architecture, there's no message at all of any sort. It's just what it is. The better architecture has got something to say, and that was really what was my finding. That's what I found. That's what I was encouraged by, that there was in the better architecture. You can say something about it. There is something within it that communicates ideas about Scotland.
Interesting. Yeah. So was there any hurdles you came across, sorry, when working on Land of Stone?
Yeah, my total incompetence for the computer, I think, which is well known to the Lewis team. Uh, I was never taught any aspect of computer, so I'm entirely self-taught. I've never been taught typing, and it may shock you to know that the entire thing was done with one finger.
Ah.
Um, so those were hurdles. I think otherwise, no. I mean, what was interesting to me was that over the years, I've acquired a fairly substantial architectural library,
Hmm.
and consciously or unconsciously, the books that were in it were the books that I needed to reference.
Ah.
So, which is intriguing. The gaps I filled by using the university library. But no, I think there were no real hurdles. The fact that I had to going back full-time employment as an
Hmm.
architect, which left no space. Um, but that was a blessing in disguise because it allowed me to stand back from what really was a pretty naive idea and reflect more maturely on it and see more widely what might be the case. So yeah, yeah, it's a long time coming, but probably the better for that, really.
Yeah, definitely. So what would you personally say was your favorite part in either writing the book or of the book, reflecting on it now, or what came most natural to you?
Wow. Well, a couple of things really.
Mhm.
The, the principal thing was that I'm no philosopher. I read philosophy entirely as someone who has an interest in it in general, but I've never been taught it. But what I found really interesting was there is a philosophical core in Scottish thinking. We tend always to assume that that's the philosophy of David Hume, Scottish common sense, empiricism. But in fact, what is also relevant is the philosophy deriving from Immanuel Kant, and there is a lot of that. And what I also found was architects expressing themselves used the kind of Kantian antinomy, that is the two poles of an argument, the thesis and the antithesis, romanticism, rationalism. They were conjoined. People talk to me about an architecture of melancholy, which is kind of pleasure and pain, and nostalgia for loss. I mean, there are two ideas contained in that. And the more I read, the more I found that people writing about art and architecture in Scotland, these are the areas they're talking about. They're talking about these kind of dual ideas. So that to me was so important because it actually gave me a framework that I didn't have before. There was actually a basis for writing about things. I could now look at what people had said and discover in it the fact that they were holding two ideas consistently and working through the two ideas, which on the face of it were opposites. And that to me was very interesting. So that was one. The other one was that I did a sort of very simplistic questionnaire, which I sent out to a whole group of architects known to me. And it was very simplistic, but people kept coming back saying this is the hardest questionnaire they've ever had to fill out. And I think it was because it was simple. The questions, some of the questions even looked daft, but I think that made them reflect. And I got such an incredible response. It was just staggering. I mean, it was gold dust what was in it, because I think many of the architects who I queried in the questionnaire had never actually sat down and examined in that sort of light what it was that they were doing. Technically, they would have examined their work. They would have examined their work in respect to what they've been taught about the modern movement at School of Architecture. They would examine their work, its legal status, but in terms of actually what was driving them, what was making them do it, how they responded to things, no, I don't think they'd ever done that before. I also had a couple of one-to-one interviews with architects, which were also extremely useful. I had a particularly interesting discussion with Richard Murphy, who I know slightly, but not well, at his astonishing house. And it was incredible to discover how much we shared in terms of interests, architects we admired, and topics that we covered. Now, I wouldn't say that Richard and I agreed on everything, but it was intriguing to find out there was some commonality there. So that all of that to me was encouraging, that there were things emerging which had really never been placed in that fashion before or recorded in that way before. It made me think that actually there was probably a larger book lying around somewhere to be done by interviewing architects and really putting them on notice, really saying, look,
Mhm.
you have to think about what you're doing, or you have to vocalize what it is you're doing, because every other architecture or culture in the world, that's what people do, and that's why it has status. And one of the problems with architecture in Scotland is it doesn't have status simply because the architects are terrified to talk about it.
I see.
I think they are. I think they're terrified for a number of reasons. One is they have this idea, if you talk about it, if you investigate it, the muse will depart. You know, somehow if you query it, then you'll kill it. And on the other hand, they're very concerned not to say anything that might put clients off.
Ah.
Yeah. So you know, I think there is caution, incredible caution, which is why we don't get very much. So for me, that discussion, those several discussions, the question and all the rest of it, incredibly illuminating. As I say, gold dust.
Mhm. I see. Well, going back to the book, the title itself, where did that come from, or how did it develop?
It comes from a chapter in a book called Anglički listi, Letters from England, written by the Czech playwright Karel Čapek. Čapek's interesting, very modern individual, and his 1920 play, Rossum's Universal Robots, gave us, in English, the word robot, which means slave or indentured service in Czech. Rossum is used as if it were a name, but it actually comes from the Czech word rozum, which means understanding or knowledge. So Čapek was interesting. The fact that he wrote about Scotland and Edinburgh in particular in such a loving fashion. I mean, he was just overcome by his experience in Edinburgh. You can tell that. So as he leaves England by train to come to Scotland, he says something to the effect of, and so to the north, the land of stone begins after the River Tweed. And I just thought, oh, that's great. That's, you know, I love that. So that's how it became Land of Stone.
Grand. Excellent. So something that caught my attention was your discussions online on LinkedIn. You'd mentioned the issues of copyright some of the images and how you turned to just hand drawing them yourself. Did that allow you to connect more, or would you say it was more of a hindrance, if you will?
No, I think it's interesting you picked that up, because over the course of my career, I suspect I must have worked half the time on existing buildings,
Mhm.
either restoring them, converting them, and doing something to them. So it wasn't all new buildings. And one of the things, of course, you do to begin with, you survey the building. And in the old days, it was all done by hand, and you drew it up by hand. And what I found was quite astonishing was the act of drawing someone else's building. I think it must be like a piano player learning a piece of music.
Mhm.
You get into the rhythm of what the person's doing, the shapes, the forms, the proportions. You're not necessarily measuring them out other than the dimensions of what they are. The window is that wide by that tall. But you begin to understand something inherently about the building and about the particular architect's way of thinking about it. So yes, using that then in terms of getting around the copyright issue, redrawing the original buildings was yeah, that's an access that opens up those buildings very definitely. One of them, one building in particular, which I only had a sort of very grainy photograph taken at an angle, and I wanted to show it orthogonally, and that is straight on, because there were issues about the shapes and proportions in it that I wanted to discuss. So I had to kind of redraw that. So the building's long gone, so I had to go to the site in George Street and pace out in the ground where the building was to find out how wide it was, and from that I could do a bit calculation to find out how tall it was. It was an estimate. But that whole process was as if I was, in a sense, redesigning that building and producing a conventional architectural elevation that the original architect might have produced. So yes, there is a very definite connection between the act of drawing something that exists already and feeling your way into it. Yeah, no question.
Yes. So if you were to sell this book to somebody, what would you say is at the core of it?
Identity.
Identity. Excellent.
Yeah,
Interesting.
It's about what it is to be Scottish, part of what it is to be Scottish. And it's using, in a way, architecture as a vehicle in order to discuss identity.
Excellent. So yes, as we begin to wrap up this interview, is there anything you wish to the possible audience to know about the Land of Stone that I may have missed or they may have missed from knowing about the book?
Well, it's not as serious as perhaps the preceding answers have been. I mean, there are, I think, fairly humorous bits in it. There's even a joke in part of it, which was told to me by a Swedish architect. It's a rather good joke. Do you want me to tell you it now? Or
Sure.
will I leave it as a surprise? Well, the joke is this, that a DFDS cruise ship sinks in a terrible tropical storm in the Indian Ocean. The search parties are sent out, but there are no survivors, there's no wreckage. 5 years later, another DFDS cruise ship is in the same location in the Indian Ocean, roughly as where the ship went down, and they come across this uncharted desert island. They send a party ashore where they find that there are 6 survivors from the sunken ship. There are 2 Danes, there are 2 Norwegians, and 2 Swedes. The Danes have formed a cooperative, the Norwegians are fighting each other, and the Swedes are standing about awkwardly waiting to be introduced. So that's the joke. But
I like that one.
I liked it because it was a kind of shorthand for sort of national characteristics. And the fact that it was told to me by a Swede was even better. Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Roger. If you're interested in getting Roger's book, Land of Stone, A Journey Through Modern Architecture in Scotland, it will be available to buy at all good bookshops or online at our website.